Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. I know it's here, at least here in Wilmington, it's dreary, but hopefully the sun will come out later on. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Mr. Gadi Dreyfus. Welcome.
Morning, everyone.
So we met, I guess, a few years back at the Fourth Friday exhibit, right? We had YSA had a Science, the Art of Observation exhibit at Expo 216, which Linda and Wade now live in Mexico, so that's now unfortunately closed down. But it just shows that science is the art of observation and how a picture tells 1,000 words. And in particular, if I remember correctly, you were very interested in our take on Mondrian and how that can relate to urban landscapes and engineering. And it's just amazing that artwork in this case, albeit very abstract, stimulated a good conversation between not only myself and you, but also young scientists as well. So, so that's really cool. I really do appreciate all your time today. I know things are busy for you. So you're currently in Atlanta now.
I am.
Yes, very good. And you're working for Guidehouse, which is a consulting firm. I guess we're going to hear a little bit about this today.
Yeah, I'll give a little intro on my path to Guidehouse and kind of what I've been doing as well.
Yes, good, excellent. Well, I know we have a good group today. Some others will join us. I know we have a lot of very keen urban sustainability planning folks here, also interested in using GIS tools in managing urban landscapes and health systems. So I know we're going to hear lots about that today. So I'll pass it over to you. And while you bring up, while you share your screen there, I'll just remind everyone to, outside of myself and Gadi, to mute your microphones and video. And if you have any questions, please put it into the chat and then I will call on you. This is a very fluid discussion, but it just helps if I just moderate things. Great, awesome.
Cool. Okay. Dr. Rob. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how we, GIS analysts and people that use GIS software, manage the urban landscape. And the urban landscape is really broad. So I'll be focusing on kind of a couple issues that are really relevant to what's going on in the world right now, and also might pique some interest in some other projects I know Dr. Rob has in tap for y'all. So I'll start with just a quick intro, and this is a logo map, and I'll take you back to where I'm from. So I was raised in South Florida, right near Miami. I moved to South Korea in high school and spent a year there. I then moved to Gainesville, Florida, and went to the University of Florida for about 4 years. And in that time period, I got to travel a bunch. This is a picture of me in India overlooking the Himalayas. My major, really consistent theme throughout all the GIS talk that we'll be going through today. I interest through geography and kind of how people move and around us, and that led me to the Florida Department of Transportation. So I worked there for a little bit on bus design and transit design. I've worked with a couple of firms in Orlando and in Wilmington that work specifically on transportation, on bike projects, on some transit planning. And then most recently, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are based. And we're working with a company called Guidehouse. And what Guidehouse does is it provides insights for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on a variety of issues. We're currently supporting them on environmental health, with the coronavirus response, so a real range of things. And I'll talk through kind of how GIS, how we're able to use GIS in so many different capacities, some for transportation, some for public health, and just in general. So there are three.
Do you have a favorite? I just
Oh,
tried
go ahead.
Do you have a favorite there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the transportation is always very interesting because it's fast moving, as you can imagine. But the Centers for Disease Control has been one of the biggest learning experiences for me. I didn't study public health, obviously, and so coming in to a public health agency has definitely been really exciting. And as you can imagine, with everything that's going on right now in the world with the COVID-19 response, it's been a really exciting place to be just at the forefront of all of public health around the world.
Yeah, I bet it's never a dull moment.
Three kind of categories that I want to talk about today. The first is our urban life, and this is really everything that goes on around us. The buildings that we work in, the houses we live in, the streets we use, government, so how all these things are managed. Streets don't pave themselves, so an agency with people design them, pave them, maintain them, and then how we can use geospatial analysis throughout all of that to manage that urban landscape in a good way, but also make it better, and we can improve them. So I'll pose a few questions to you guys. What are some things that come to mind when you think of urban life, when you think of government, maybe what you think of when you think of geospatial analysis?
Yeah, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute your microphone at this point and just say that. So maybe just repeat the question.
Sure. So just a little discussion on what comes to mind when you think of what the government is, what urban life looks like. And I know Dr. Rob has done some projects with you on geospatial analysis. So what have you learned about different components for what GIS and geospatial analysis is?
Yeah, so I'll give a hint, because we did this with Plotly, and we were sort of mapping out all our projects all over the place. So that may be a clue. No, you're gonna have to go for it.
Okay. Also, I apologize. I'm new to Zoom, so I just saw that there's a blinking chat. Okay, I'll just go through them, and you guys can add if you have anything. Yeah. Does this look familiar to y'all? This street?
It should.
So this is downtown Wilmington. It's actually a very urban area, and you can tell because you see all of these buildings very close to the street. You see wide sidewalks, lots of trees, maybe one lane in either direction. It's very pretty, and you have, if you look very closely, some sharrows for bicyclists. For government, obviously the government is huge, but I'll focus on a couple of agencies that use a lot of GIS. I mentioned the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They work a lot with GIS and public health. So anything related to public health that happens in space, the CDC has a whole team dedicated to using GIS to better understand public health and improve the public health response to any sort of public health issue. There's also the Department of Transportation that uses a lot of GIS. The Environmental Protection Agency uses GIS in all sorts of environments. In urban development as well, would use GIS to map all the housing that we have in the US that they run. So GIS is made up of 5 kind of components to study the world and to make sense of all the things that go on around us. One component is software. Obviously, it's a computer software that we use. Hardware, you need to have certain data management infrastructure in place to do GIS. You also need to have people that you can study, that you can produce data from, and also that you can analyze. Data, obviously, and analysis are also parts of this geospatial process. Oops. So a little bit on the story of GIS, and what I find really interesting about GIS is that the concept of geospatial analysis is really rooted in public health as well. Obviously, it wasn't until this man, John Snow, in 1854, he was living in London, England, and was faced with a cholera outbreak in his neighborhood. And what he, as a scientist, what he as a scientist was interested in was studying what sort of trends were there in this cholera outbreak and how can we prevent it. So originally they thought that cholera at that time in 1854 was airborne. And so they thought that if you coughed or sneezed or if it was in the air, you could contract cholera. And slowly but surely what they realized is that cholera is not airborne, but in fact waterborne. And when they made that realization, John Snow started to think, well, how can I use that information to study where the outbreaks of cholera are happening and potentially help solve this public health issue of a cholera outbreak? So this is a really famous map that is his cholera map from 1854 in London. And what it shows is the outbreaks, all of the cases of cholera in his neighborhood. And you can start to see some trends, right? There's a lot here kind of in the center. There are some here along the edges. But what all of these have in common is that they got their water from this specific tap. Identifying an issue, but placing them on a map is that this tap was the issue, was the source of the outbreak for cholera. They then replaced the tap and the cholera outbreaks decreased immediately. So because of his geospatial insight, we were able to, in 1854, reduce cholera outbreaks almost immediately, simply by identifying that the water tap in that area was the issue. It wasn't this water tap, that water tap, or that water tap. It really was just one. Okay. Are there any questions on that, or should I continue?
No, but this is cool. So I do want to make the point that it just shows you that history is a part of science here as well. Yeah, and what I'll do here, this reminds me of a paper that one of my colleagues published recently about plastic pollution in the ocean, and they went on a world expedition of retracing Magellan's expeditions, which is pre-industrial revolution, right? And it's just amazing, just like having that baseline with no plastic and then retracing the steps, and the oceans are full of plastic. It just shows you how like history can be used in so many ways to extract data and even help develop technology. I think that's super cool.
Yeah, and it's really impactful. You know, GIS is not something that you publish and it sits on a shelf. It really has the potential to change lives, and in this case, public health, to save lives. But we'll go through a couple more applications where you can really see how useful GIS can be. So in all of these, you'll see a common theme, which are maps. So there are lots of types of maps. I'll go through kind of a few, but they come really in all shapes and sizes. Types of information, and to tell a story, the story that we want to tell. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see something called a graduated circle map. And this is a very recent map from the New York Times, and it's showing the COVID-19 outbreak in the United States. And what's really neat about this map is that you can see obviously that the outbreak is widespread, but the size of the circle indicates how large the outbreak is in that area. And so you see there's a huge outbreak, or the largest outbreak around New York City, but there are also areas like here in Chicago and Los Angeles that also have really large outbreaks, and you can see that really clearly. The next one is schematic maps. So this doesn't have the same boundaries that this map has, but it still is very useful. This is a subway map for the city of Atlanta, and it shows you what you need to know if you're taking the subway. You really need to know where to go and what transfer stations to get off at. This next one is a political map, It's showing the counties in North Carolina, and there's New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender County, where Wilmington is. But this is strictly showing different political boundaries. What's great about GIS and what we can use from these maps is that we're able to layer them. So while this map is good on its own and this map is very useful on its own, GIS gives you the ability to layer all these things in one place and tell whatever story it is you would like to tell with your data.
So Jayla has a question with the COVID-19.
Yeah.
Is it possible for the COVID-19 to be water?
The last bit there was she was asking about waterborne. Is it possible?
That's a great question. As far as I'm aware, it is airborne, but I believe it can. I am not the authority to say whether it is waterborne or not, but I know that we have focused on it being airborne more so than it being waterborne. But
Yeah.
Certainly for different diseases that are waterborne, you can use similar maps to show where there might be outbreaks.
Yeah, and right. So one way to do that, and Jayla, this could be a project that we could work on, right? Because we are going to put together an e-newsletter, is that we could at some level put, river systems, or even like pick a city and find out where the plumbing is, the pipes and all that type of stuff. And then maybe find out, do some data mining, and then plot these. I think it's a great question, a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also,
and it would be really great around Wilmington, right, where there's so much water.
Right. Exactly. And in fact, as a good follow-up, Annika, you have a question. Do you have a microphone on your computer? You can ask your question.
It was my dad's question, so he can say it.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Hans.
We have drinking water problem in Wilmington. The only solution seems to be so far to not drink the water. What do you think would be a successful way to change our drinking water issue, which is coming from a company upriver?
So I think there are two issues here. One is understanding the extent of the actual. So the first part would be a data side to say, okay, how is it affecting all the drinking water? Is it affecting different areas more or less, upstream, downstream? How is that filtering into, say, tap water versus non-potable water? And then the next step would be reaching out to politicians that can push either these companies or legislation to then change what chemicals they can put into the water, and or how different water systems can clean or filter the water before it gets to you.
Would a map image like you've shown here, where the water is going, and even colors of how it's affecting people, be an effective tool?
Yeah, and I think especially in the case of drinking water, it can be, because while there might be a chemical contamination in the river, it's not always directly related distribution networks, and they might draw water from a different county or from a different area. They may pull it from the river and clean it through whatever process before piping it to your house, but that would be definitely a good place to start. I mean, you have naturally occurring water systems, and then you also have artificial water systems on top of that connect to your house.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then the other caveat to that just is there are both public water systems that we're attached to as well as private wells, and so if you're on a private well, that may be a different story.
All right, cool.
Okay. So in telling your map, and I think this is something that you guys have worked on a little bit before with Plotly and putting up different maps, but there are some fundamentals in map design that will help you communicate your story better. And these are things to keep in mind as you're producing your maps, and we'll go through kind of the process that you can take and the questions that you should be asking along the way. But these are some of the critical components you need to have in a map for it to be, to communicate your points both in a visually effective way, but also in a scientifically effective way to make sure that all the information that you've collected is being conveyed. So the first is a frame line. You never want to have a map that just sits there. It needs to be contained in some sort of box. You want to show the whole map area to the extent possible. Here we have South America in its entirety, so we're not chopping off part of Chile and Argentina or Brazil. We want to show the full extent of our data analysis. We always, always, always want a title and sometimes a subtitle where it's applicable. But the title and subtitle are your hooks. When I see, I know what I'm looking at, I understand what these colors can mean, and it really helps orient you. 4 is legend. Of course, if you're going to have colors or icons or anything on your map, always have what they mean in the frame line. It shouldn't be off to the side, it shouldn't be hard to find, it should be very, very clear. This sometimes is one that gets forgotten, even in higher level like publications, is data source. So if you are ever displaying data on a map, always show the source. And the source doesn't have to be necessarily something published. It can be data that you've collected on your own, but always make mention of where the data is coming from, because if I'm looking at this, I obviously want to know, how did you collect this data? Where are you getting it from? If I want to do this type of analysis on my own, how can I learn from it and recreate it? 6 is scale. South America is a huge place, I know, and so we always want to have a scale bar somewhere on the map. Typically it ends up being on the bottom, but it does not always have to be, depending on how the map is oriented. And lastly, a directional arrow. North is the most typical, but you can put a compass rose on it, but always orient the user, the person that's reading the map, to what we're looking at using direction.
There's a good point about the data source, like the reference, because you can get into quite a bit of trouble, especially if you publish this in a journal. But is it important also to put the date that you access the information?
I would say in data source, if you have the space, put as much information as you can. Here we have like data from Country Watch in 2002, and so it doesn't matter as much the date that the data was accessed, more when the data was created, because it hasn't changed since 2002. That's the data set that we're referencing here. But sure, if it's a regularly updated data set, or if it's one where the date that you access it would be an important feature, then definitely include that as well. Okay, so now that we know what we need to put on our map, thinking through some of the questions that you can ask to make your map is going to be really important. And this is a process that you can follow both to make maps, but it's also part of the scientific process. And so the first, considering what's going on around us. If you look around your neighborhood or you'll notice that certain things are happening. Things change, things move. So taking note of what that actual phenomena is and what you would like to study about it. The next is determining what you would like to convey with your map. Why are you creating this map? What's the type of story you're trying to tell? And you really want to determine these things before you go out and collect data. Data is really hard to collect. Sometimes you can go online and find it, but if you are going out in the field, which we'll talk about in a minute, if you're walking around, it's very tedious. So you want to make sure you have all of your ducks in a row before you start to collect data rather than afterwards. And then once you've collected your data, you can start to design and construct a map, but you always want to go back to the end user. So while you might be creating a map that looks great to you, if I'm someone who has no context, am I able to look at the map and really understand it? And this process is a loop. So you can design it, get feedback, say, oh, I want to change this color this more clear. And you go back and forth until you have a really solid map at the end. Did we lose Dr. Rob? I wanted to see if you want to add something.
Nope, I'm here. This is great.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I want to go into a little bit of an application, and we'll go into how we can use this in our daily lives in a minute, but how we use GIS in public health. So you'll see here John Snow's cholera map, kind of as the foundation of what we call epidemiology. But I also want to think about when we talk about health and public health and GIS, really what we're talking about is the intersection of place and health. So how does being in a certain place, in a spatial place, affect my health and vice versa? And so I'll highlight here the CDC because they're the premier National Institutes for Health you might hear about now in some of the presidential briefings. But the CDC is still really the agency that folks look to for using GIS, for doing research, and for really responding to public health crises. So what CDC does is they do a lot of tracking and surveillance of public health issues. So they spend a lot of time and effort on collecting data from people and communities on health-related issues. And this can be a variety of things. This can be medical, that's one side, but it can also be water and air, because if your water is not clean or your air is not clean, that can affect your health. And so they also will collect data on those features as well. The next is investigating contamination. So there are, like we said in the first slide with government, there are a lot of different agencies that will respond to certain things that happen. For example, a chemical spill or dirty water, dirty air. CDC will get pulled in to investigate anything that relates to public health. So if you're in a populated area and there's a chemical spill, maybe an oil truck falls off the road, they would be called in to help do an investigation on what the public health impacts would be from that either disaster or spill or whatever happened. The next is that they always help assess and improve health in the community. So in order to do all of the investigation, et cetera, and make it meaningful, they need to write up reports on what exactly the impacts are to public health. Maybe it's what they can do to improve health in that community. They can make recommendations to the city or to the state to say, in order to address this chemical spill, the CDC recommends you do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes they're able to do that. In the case of water and air, sometimes they provided filters depending on the case, but they are able to provide on-the-ground solutions. That CDC has been stressing a lot recently, which is health equity. And I'm sure Dr. Rob has talked a little bit about equity in our communities in past projects, but really how our resources are spread out over space is not always equal. It's not always equitable. And so CDC always takes into consideration that certain areas which don't have the same access to resources as others are prioritized, and that they're really helping those communities from a public health standpoint address their needs.
Yeah, and the topic of equity, that could be a seminar series.
Yeah.
And like, it's not just public health, right? It's across the board. Education is another big one.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to voting and things like this. So I did not know that this was a priority at CDC.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll mention too, that you're in Atlanta and CDC is also based in Atlanta, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. And I also wanted to say, so for health equity, this translates to a few different areas. You might not think of grocery stores or fresh food as being a health-related issue, but there are some areas that don't have access to fresh food, and the only available food they have is a dollar store or fast food. And so CDC also maps through GIS where there are certain areas that have access to a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables and where they don't. Because as you can imagine, if you don't have access to fruits and vegetables and you're the only food or restaurants you have access to are fast food, that will impact your health. The next two are where there are hospitals and doctors' offices. I mean, in Wilmington, it's pretty dense and very urban, and so you can imagine hospital would not take so long. But there are some areas in the country, for example, out west, where there's a lot of distance between where people live and where the services are. And so you can imagine in areas where the closest hospital is a 2.5-hour drive, what do you do if there's an emergency? If you break your leg and you're 3 hours from a hospital, how can CDC help map what your needs are in rural communities? And then lastly, these are more in the moment, but if there's a chemical spill, it affects potentially populations surrounding just that spill, but it could also have implications for areas way further than just where that spill happened. For example, if an oil spill happens in a river, it affects not only the communities surrounding the area of that spill, but as the oil travels down the river, it will affect those communities as well. So CDC takes all this into consideration when thinking about public health, and they really try to map out where they should be prioritizing the resources along all of these issues, but especially along health equity these days.
Gadi, would you say that there is more of an, would you say rural, urban communities, there's kind of a deficit in terms of the information that's available versus, say, big cities like Atlanta and DC and New York? Or are rural communities on par with the big cities?
For data?
Yeah, for data and information and maps and things.
Yeah, so I think in general, and this is a generalization, so certain rural communities that have put a lot of time and effort into producing good data have certainly maybe equitable or equal types of data as urban areas, but generate more dense data sets, more rich data sets than rural areas. And that's because that's where obviously more people are, more resources are, and where there's a lot more, or where there has been a lot more interest, right? If there are a lot more people there, people tend to focus their time and energy on those areas. And so there is definitely an effort to include more and better more rural data, but as is, rural data is certainly harder to come by in a more accurate fashion.
Yeah. Is Wilmington pretty good?
Wilmington is pretty urban. So you should be good for Wilmington. I think if you move.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll add to that. The quality of the data is also really dependent on the government agencies that collect them. So the CDC, as Dr. Rob mentioned, is based in Atlanta. So there are a lot of local partners, so departments of public health and folks in the states and in cities and in rural areas to collect data as well. And so while the CDC collects some national level data, a lot of their work comes from partnerships from the states and from counties and from local municipalities, et cetera. I wanted to share with you guys one tool that I think will be really interesting. And this is, if you're interested in more of the data behind what CDC collects, there's a tool called the Environmental Public Health Tracking Network. And this is one kind of interface to the tool, but you can download all of this data. And what it is you can type in your area. So I typed in New Hanover County. And what it will do is it will pull up all the health statistics for New Hanover County. So you can see it has some economic data. It has data specifically related to asthma, which is a large issue that CDC focuses on. It focuses on air quality as well, some smoking statistics, heat, heart attacks. Let me go back. Access to parks, which you might not think has a direct correlation to health, but think about health equity, that discussion we had on if you live near a park or if you have a lot of trees around, you're probably more likely to go to the park to exercise, to be outside more, which will lead to a healthier lifestyle. And so if you have no parks near you and no greenery, then you might tend to stay inside or not go out as much, and that can impact your health. And so they have all this data. You can type in any county in the U.S. and you can download all of this data. It tells you, as all good maps should, the data source, where it's coming from, when it was collected, where these slides are shared the link afterwards through Dr. Rob to make sure that you have access to this website. But we've found it very helpful, and it's very applicable to obviously where you live in New Hanover County or Brunswick, but also to any county that you're interested in learning more about in the U.S.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's 100 things going through my mind at the moment. One of the things is a little project that we've been working on at YSA is looking at thermal landscapes of like sort of downtown Wilmington versus the suburbs. And we have this little thermal camera that we borrowed from a colleague at UNCW. And like if you take the north side of Wilmington, on average, it is 10 degrees Celsius warmer in the summertime than say out at Mason Borough Loop because of the type of surface that's there. It's mainly impervious surface concrete.
Yeah.
That, which, you know, you might think, well, okay, so what? Well, that can feed into like increased energy costs for those neighborhoods which are already impoverished or experiencing financial strain. So
yeah, and even from a public health side, if you know that that area is going to have higher temperatures, you can let maybe folks who shouldn't be outside when it's so hot or need to be extra mindful of hydration, you can let them know in advance that there's going to be a really hot day and it will be 10 degrees hotter because of where they are, because of the surface areas that they're going to be walking on, biking on, whatever.
Yeah, that's cool. The other thing that we're going to be working on here, and I don't know if this exists, is noise pollution. Do you know if noise pollution exists in this database?
I don't believe they track it in the Environmental Health Public Tracking Network, but I can look into more of the CDC data and see if there's something specific to noise pollution.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. The next area I want to talk about is GIS and transportation. And so we use GIS in transportation for a variety of different things. Some of these will look familiar, but really it's to make sure that roads are safe and that we're improving traffic conditions for all types of users on the road. And we'll get into different user types in a minute. But in addition, we also use GIS for environmental sustainability. And you might wonder, what does environmental sustainability have to do with transportation, right? Transportation is roads, buses, bikes, people walking, but really they're linked at the hip. And the reason is because any transportation project impacts the environment. So if you're building a highway, not only are you clearing certain trees or areas to build that highway, but you're also encouraging, means they're burning more gas, etc. Likewise, if you build a bike lane or if you build a bike trail, you encourage that type of behavior. So you encourage cyclists to go out and ride more. You encourage people to walk more, to run more. And that has a lot of impacts both on the environment and even on our public health. And so they're really all interrelated. A few of the things here, so you might have seen these cameras around that capture your license plate if you run through a red light. But those are also a part of GIS, right? That links back to a system that the government maintains, and they're able to link that camera to a specific intersection that has a space in the city, and they can then connect that to your license plate and charge you your fine. Likewise, here in the middle, while this is automatic, a lot of the data collection is still manual. And so here's a guy who's at I believe the University of Minnesota, counting the number of cyclists that go by every hour. And so he can create data points to say, oh, I see that in the morning from 9 to 10, there are a lot of cyclists. Maybe it goes down around lunchtime, and as classes end, it really picks up again. And so he can collect all of these data points just by sitting here and observing what is going on around him. Here is a Google Maps view, and this also uses GIS. And so what they can do is they can measure in space in real time what the traffic conditions are and lead you to obviously the best route. And likewise, if you're a cyclist, there are many, and we'll get into this later, many different people that are helping make sure that your cycling trip or even driving trip or walking trip are safe, and that you have some of the best facilities to walk, bike, or drive on in a safe manner. And for context, this city is in North Carolina. It's not Wilmington, but if any of it looks familiar, it's in Raleigh. Okay, so I mentioned we talk about who's using the road. So these are different types of users that we might find on the road. And like the map, where we have to consider who is actually going to be reading this, interpreting this, we really want to focus on, in transportation, who is actually using the road. And so we have cars that use the road, we have cyclists that use the road, and we have pedestrians. Maybe they're walking or they're running. Sometimes they'll use the sidewalk, but if there's no sidewalk, then they'll be on the road. What do you think some of the different needs for each of these users might be? You know, if you're in a car, what is your need on the road? If you're a cyclist, what do you need to feel safe and to get to your destination quickly and safely, and likewise for a pedestrian?
Angie, I'm going to call on you here. So, Angie, you want to cover the car? What are the needs of a vehicle on the road?
I just had it. I mean, probably going long distancing.
Okay, so you need long roads.
Yeah.
To go far.
It's like going from like maybe Washington to California.
Yep.
A smooth surface, right?
Yep, you don't want any potholes.
You don't want
along the way.
Yep.
Do you think that's the same need as a cyclist? Do they need a road that goes from Washington, D.C. to California?
I mean, yes, but that would take longer.
If you're on a bike, are you generally going across country, or are you maybe going down the road to the grocery store to pick up some groceries for the week?
Down the road.
Down the road. So maybe you need really well-maintained short roads, whereas cars need much larger surfaces to ride on. And what about if you're a pedestrian? What are some of your needs?
The sidewalk.
Sidewalk, yeah, all good things. So here's something I thought of as well, and you guys ideally no traffic. If you're a cyclist, you need bicycle lanes or some bicycle infrastructure, or really wide sidewalks that you can ride on. And if you're running, you really need shade from the sun. It can get really hot, and so in addition to sidewalks, you need a good environment to run in. So from a GIS perspective, we have a checklist, right? We have a list of needs for all of these users. We have space for cars, bicycle lanes, wide sidewalks, and lots of trees. So what you see two types of road here. Which ones do you think are better for each of the types of users that we have? So if you're a car and you're looking at the first one, what sort of things can you take note of? What data points do you have to measure whether this would be good for cars or for cyclists or for pedestrians? What sort of things are you observing?
Cyrus, I'm going to have you jump in there. Cyrus and Scott can have a crack at this.
Okay.
What was the question again?
Like
So
the first,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the first picture there, if you're is that first picture there, is that more, you worded it better.
Okay, so we have two types of streets here, right? What are some of the features that you see that if you're a car, you would say, oh, wow, that's great. I really like this road. Or if you're a cyclist, you would say, oh, I don't like this road. I don't feel very safe on here. And so, for example, you can look at this checklist and say, is there space for cars? there are 4 lanes for cars here. So I would say, yeah, there's a lot of space for cars. But for example, there's no bike lane. So if you're a cyclist and you want to ride on this road, you might think twice because there's not infrastructure safe, very comfortable with cars riding right behind you in this lane in order for you to feel safe. What other things do you notice maybe in both of these pictures that are good or bad?
I think on the second picture, there's a bicycle lane. There's
Yep.
more trees.
Yep.
The first one, there's more buildings with no shade.
Yeah, that's perfect. And what's great about these is that they're all data points. So each one of these things, you have one road, and you can measure maybe how many light poles there are, and you can put that into GIS, or you can measure how wide are these lanes, and you can put that into GIS, and you can measure which roads have bike lanes, which ones don't, which ones have trees, how many trees, are they shading the sidewalks? And that way you can start to get to a better picture, to paint a better picture of where it might be safer or more enjoyable for all these different types of users on the road when they use the facility. I'll go back just to one piece. So this is the bike ped plan from Raleigh, and what they've done is similar. So they've said these areas here on Hargett and Martin Street, those are in red. And so what they've said is those streets might look something like this. They're not great for cyclists. You can ride on them, but they're not great for cyclists or for running. However, there are these other streets here that are green that are really great for cycling. And so if you're a cyclist and you need to get from here, maybe from this side to that side, you might not want to go on this red down here, then come back up. But it's a much more enjoyable ride, and there are transportation planners who use GIS to make sure that all these things are taken into consideration when planning a route for you.
That's actually really cool. And I, as a very, very keen cyclist, I ride every day.
Mm-hmm.
With the second picture, I would say as a cyclist, that's the one that I want to be in.
Right.
And even then,
Right.
there are dangers, right? Like if you're riding in the bike lane and a car pulls out from a park spot, or someone opens a door, bang, you're gonna get hurt.
Yeah.
I would also say in the second picture, the lines are more clearly marked, right? I don't know if that's something that is often considered when
well, that's a really interesting point. They are considered, and that's another data point, right? So you can put into the computer, say, or into GIS, when they put down this paint. And so this looks pretty fresh, right? Like maybe this was painted in the last 6 months. And so you could put that time in to say, okay, this was painted in October of 2019. And then you can have in GIS this piece of road maybe light up when in a year this paint will have degraded and it now needs to be repainted. So you can do all of this in GIS, and it helps you manage these good facilities. In this case, maybe they can do a little bit of a better job going back and painting on these stripes. But you're right, this is a much nicer environment to ride on because they have all these clear the paint is very clear and they have good signage.
And as a side note, believe it or not, my wife and my eldest son were discussing this on their walk the other night. And so I don't know if this is something that is also planned into like the repainting thing, but when the paint wears away, there seems to be a mark. How is the paint put on the roads? Do you know this? Is it like a tar underneath?
It's like an adhesive paint.
Gotcha.
So it goes, and it usually, ideally it goes on when you're paving, and so the paint will melt with the tar, but in certain cases when you're just repainting, they'll put a type of adhesive paint on to make sure it's like sticking to the tar, to the asphalt, and that it doesn't erode as much over time. But these things, like pavement, the paint also erodes, and when I was at Florida DOT, I worked on kind of the design for these types of roads, but there were other people whose main job it was to make sure that they were keeping track of how old the roads were. If there's a road that's 30 years old that hasn't been worked on in decades, maybe they need to go check it out and make sure there are no potholes on it, or to make sure that the paint is still clear. So there are people who are maintaining these logs in GIS to say, I need to make sure that if we haven't touched a road in 30 years, someone is going to check in on it, and that we're making sure that they're all up to date.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So here I have, in this, you're right, this second one is much better for all of the users of the road. And so you can imagine the impacts that this has on public health and on people's lives, right? This little design change means that more people will go out running and walking, more people will be biking, which means that people will be living healthier lives, right? And they might be driving less, so they're polluting less. But overall, this is a much more people-oriented, healthy, focused design than the other picture. Okay, so real-world applications, right? How can we take this GIS and kind of this complicated idea and move it into our personal lives? And so I'd encourage you guys to consider the mapping process, right? What are some things that you see in your day-to-day life around your neighborhood that are changing? We're living through a really extraordinary time right now. And so we are going through, as a country and as a world, we're going through a lot of change. I can imagine more people are home, people aren't going to their offices as much, they're not driving around as much. Those are changes that we can measure. And so I would consider looking around and taking note of which ones interest you. Is it that there are more people walking in the evenings? Is it that there are fewer cars on the road? Is it how many hours you're spending at home versus where you used to spend them at school and at the store and going all around? And think about what kind of story measuring the amount of cars that are going past your house at a certain hour. Maybe you can make a map that has, at different points of the day, a larger circle, a smaller circle based on the number of cars that are going past your house. And maybe you can compare that to when we reopen and everything goes back to somewhat normal. You can compare that data to new data and see what that change looks like. And you can do this on your own. Go outside like the guy with the clipboard. You sit there for an hour and just count the cars that go by, count the people, count the cyclists, and you can make really, really nice maps and tell really fun stories. And then I'd encourage you too, behind every map is that narrative. And so instead of thinking just about the visual and creating the map, which is obviously very important, think about what you want to say about it. So in addition to the fact that looking at why these changes are occurring and maybe what impacts they're having on our lives. And so instead of just measuring that there are more people walking out now or there are fewer people driving, you can say this is caused by a policy, by stores closing because of the coronavirus. And you can create a really nice narrative to tell your story with your map. Dr. Rob, did you want to add something?
I do.
Yeah.
I love it. I love Atlanta. So this is a good comparison because the public transportation is great in Atlanta, but there's still lots of traffic, right?
Yeah.
But have you noticed a difference during the stay-at-home order?
Yeah. So, I like Dr. Rob, I like to ride my bike a lot. And so I go riding several times a week. And what I've noticed from a couple of weeks ago when we were obviously a lot of traffic in Midtown and downtown Atlanta, and the change till now has been drastic. I went for a ride the other night around rush hour, so around 5, 6 p.m., and there were very few cars on the road. So the streets were pretty much empty. No one had anywhere to be. They were all home. And so there has definitely been an impact, both a visual impact, because I can see that there are fewer cars, but also an impact on how I use the road. I feel comfortable on the road because there are fewer cars. I feel like I can exert. So yeah, there have definitely been some real palpable changes from the stay-at-home policies.
That's interesting because I actually think New Hanover County, it's almost like business as usual. It would be interesting to do this, you know, pre, during, and post comparison of, you know, traffic. Yes, with COVID.
Yeah. Yeah.
Annika has her hand raised, so I think she has a question. So go ahead.
Sure.
It's actually Annika's dad. Use the face of Annika. I'm like Dr. Rob. I'm just really into this topic, and I was born in Atlanta and grew up in the 70s when the subway built in Atlanta, and I've always wanted to try to figure this out. But if I could ask you, I lived at Peachtree and North Avenue, so right downtown Atlanta. There was a subway stop within a block of where we lived, and the subway never took off. It was for many years like a ghost town when you would go to a subway location in Atlanta. And then to DC, and everybody used the subway in DC. So
Yeah.
my question is, what do you think was, you know, for the subway maybe not working out in Atlanta compared to other cities?
So I think it's too. I think Atlanta is a very different the 70s. So when they put in the subways, there weren't as many people near the subway stations to use them, and there weren't as many destinations to go to on the subway. And since then, since Midtown has really grown dramatically and people have moved into downtown and around that area, like the Peachtree, North Ave area, too, there are a lot more apartment buildings than there were. And so there are a lot more people that want to get around. And likewise, there are more destinations to go to using the subway, MARTA, further outside of town. For example, I live several blocks north of where you mentioned, and I'm able to take MARTA all the way out almost to the suburbs to go to work, where our office is. That wouldn't have been possible earlier, where a company might have located their offices in a drivable suburb as opposed to being on MARTA, on the line. And so there's definitely been a shift there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will. Transit agencies, not specific to Atlanta, I think this is in all major cities, New York, Washington, D.C., et cetera, they're facing a lot of decline in ridership, as you can imagine. A lot of people who normally would take the subway to go to work no longer need to commute to go into the office. And so that has a lot of impacts on how they raise money to fund all of their repairs and how they can pay their workers. And so that's also another aspect to this change that we've been going through, is that in addition to people driving less and going out less, it has real impacts on transit agencies who have a decline in ridership.
Yeah, Melbourne in Australia it's a great public transport system, but it's always losing money. Always. Yeah. I happen to love the metro in DC. I love it. I love DC, but I love the metro. It's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, well, really quickly, just on like funding public transit. This is a topic that might come up in various ways, but services that are provided to the public are not always making money, right? It's not always the motivation for a government agency to make a profit on the service that they're providing. And so you might read that a lot of public agencies in public health, a lot, and also in public transportation, that their role is to provide a service to the people. And it's not always to be profitable. And so while there might be a decline in ridership currently and throughout as it ebbs and flows, their mission remains the same, right? To get people from place A to place B. And so that, yeah, they are not always out to be profitable necessarily and to make money, but just to provide that service.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions on how we can take what we've learned and apply it to kind of our lives? And I'll talk in the next slide about where we can go, like what careers you can take with GIS, because really the possibilities are endless. Okay. So I mentioned a couple of roles that we use GIS in throughout. I mentioned transportation planning. I mentioned epidemiologists, and specifically those who use GIS are called spatial epidemiologists. And what that is they're studying the spread of a disease or any sort of public health issue across space. And so as a disease, as there's an outbreak in one area and then it moves to another, a spatial epidemiologist would be in charge of learning about and studying how that disease travels and how they can map and share other decisions. Likewise, urban planning. So I showed you the map, the bike plan map. They might come into effect there, right? They might have thoughts on how to design a street or how to design buildings to be more, to affect public health or to be more transit friendly. And so they can also use GIS to make those decisions. One role we didn't talk as much about, and it's certainly a place that GIS can take you, is like geology. They use a lot of GIS to measure what types of soils we're building on or how water moves through soils. And so there's a whole other world that we didn't talk about as much here in using GIS in hard sciences as well, if that's more your cup of tea.
Yeah,
but really, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say beach renourishment, mapping of sea level rise and impacts on coastal marshes, dredging projects in the Cape Fear River, which is coming up, and potential sediment plumes. There are three big ones where knowing the science behind it, the geology, the physics, is a big thing.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think there are always two sides to the coin, right? For all of GIS, there's the one side of creating the map, and you can have the best data and the best map, but there's also a large part of it, which is storytelling and making people care about your maps, making them communicate what you want to communicate out to people. And that's really where a lot of the fun lies, right? Like you can look through all of the data and you can collect data, and that's definitely important in one side. But for me, what's also really exciting is that I get to take that data, mix and mash it, produce some really nice visualizations, and tell a great story. You're really getting to tell someone a story.
Yeah, and that's the soundbite for the week, right there. We hit it time and time again.
Yeah.
Tell the story. What is the so what factor, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the issue with scientists in general, is that they want to tell you everything they know, but they're not telling a story. And when they do show a diagram or something, it looks boring. It's not there for grabbing attention, and that's a shame because there are so many really important stories to be told. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the main takeaway here is that you can do that. If you're interested in the data side, you can go as far deep into the data as you'd like, but you can also really work on, your storytelling skills with GIS. So it really checks all the boxes. So the last thing I'll leave you with are some resources. More academic. There are a couple of fun online resources. One is Weekly Map. The other is Sporkle. Weekly Map is just a blog that will give you a map. For example, here, where you can see Russia is very red, and you have the Philippines in a dark red too, and you have to guess what the map is showing. You have to guess from just the colors, what is the story they're trying to tell. And then you can submit your guesses, and the person running the blog will let you know each week what the actual representation of the colors mean. But it's a really good exercise to say, if I take out all the other elements, I don't have a title, I don't have a scale, I don't have a legend, what could this map be telling us? And what could that story be? The next is Sporkle. You may have heard of Sporkle for other types of quizzes, but they actually have a whole geography section. And so I'd encourage you, some of them are for the US, some of them are for the whole world, but it really increases your awareness of where all of the countries are in a fun way, and can teach you things about cities that you didn't know. And then lastly, and this is a little bit more academic, but they have really, really good writing as well as really good maps. It's a website called City Lab. And if you go to City Lab, you can read about everything that's going on in the urban world currently, as well as if you go back or search in the search bar for specific areas like Wilmington, you can find stories that they've written about North Carolina or about certain cities, and you can read up on them. So it's a really, really good resource.
That's way too cool. The weekly map, we're going to be posting this one on social media and get the conversation.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it back in the day.
I have no idea what this Russia one is. I have no idea. Yeah, interesting. And the Philippines, I have no idea. This is cool. We're going to be doing this. Yeah. So this is brilliant. Shall we open it up for questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what I can do here is you're now the full screen.
Okay.
All right. So anyone got any questions here? I'm going to kick things off here. So we have a lot of budding young scientists, in particular, a lot of girls that are really getting interested in engineering, computer science, that type of thing. Do you have any advice for pursuing careers in urban planning and engineering in general? And
sure.
What are some of the subjects that they should be really sort of focusing on and trying to really harness?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first aspect is that there's no straight path. And so regardless of where you would like to go, follow what feels right to you in the moment. If you have a curiosity about something, really dive into it, lean into what you're interested in, and you can learn so much about obviously every type of topic, but let that passion really drive you. And then the second is, there are certain courses that allow for a lot of flexibility. My favorite course in high school, and what led me to pursue a geography degree in college, was my human geography class. I'm not sure, are folks in high school or kind of a range?
They're upper elementary.
Oh, okay.
School, but Simon,
I'm high school.
Yeah, you're high school, Simon.
I'm the only one.
Yeah, so for example, human geography is a great way to just learn about all the things we mentioned from the data side as well as the storytelling side. If this type of work interests you, anthropology could also be a really interesting route to go down. And again, that has a lot of data elements and storytelling components that you can work on as well.
And physics?
Yeah, and as well as the hard sciences. If you want to go into physics, chemistry, biology, GIS definitely has a role. Think about if you're interested in anything related to public health, like we've mentioned, there are endless ways that you can use this type of GIS, but also any sort of technical skill that you develop to apply to those types of issues.
Great. Sibon, you can ask your question.
Yeah, do you use Python for the maps? Because that's what Rob's been using with us for mapping stuff. Python is a great language to know for mapping, and so you can develop your maps out in Python directly, or you can use different packages or software. Like we use a lot of QGIS, Quantum GIS, which is less focused on the Python aspect, although you can definitely plug Python in, but it tends to be more user-friendly for folks. So we do a lot of QGIS in our work, but Python is definitely one of the most widespread languages and can serve you really well if you know how to use it, and you can use it in a GIS way.
Yeah, I'll thank Sibon for that question. That one of the sort of challenges with GIS is the packaging. right? So do you use a PC or a Mac? But like there's a lot of expense with many of these programs. So QGIS, I think my wife uses with her job. Is that open source?
It's open source.
Yeah. Good.
So totally free.
Yeah, because ArcGIS, my goodness gracious. It's...
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, very cool. So Cyrus, do you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add one more. And actually, Cyrus, your question kind of hits on the point I was going to raise, is that in addition to writing your own code to do geospatial analysis, there's so many good resources out there online. For example, currently there are several COVID trackers that use a lot of geospatial data. So you can, I'm sure, Dr. Rob, you've seen some of the ones from the New York Johns Hopkins University and from the University of Virginia that have great maps of different COVID outbreaks and that they're tracking. So you can definitely use some of those to get a better handle on like what you can do with GIS. And you can reference like the types of maps. You know, the one from New York Times was the graduated circle map. They have that for Johns Hopkins as well. You'll come into contact with a lot of coral plot maps, which are a lot of fun as well, kind of an array of colors across different counties. So you can take note of different techniques they're using to tell their story and incorporate them into your dashboards in the future.
I'm checking the Worldometer website. I'm practically 20 times a day. It's not as pretty, but they're the reason why I do that is they're updating the numbers constantly. So.
Yeah, and Cyrus, to answer your question about it being anonymous, so a lot of those data represent, when you see a number of 90,000 cases, those are 90,000 people that we have data points from, but there are a lot of regulations around how you can access individual level data, and so something that's important for public health is always leveling up to make sure that when you're looking at a specific group, that there are enough data points in the group for it to be anonymous. If there are areas with only 1 or 2 cases, usually they won't report those publicly because it can be identified to a specific individual. And so, yeah, that's a huge part of what CDC does, is making sure that that data is anonymous. Any data that you get from the CDC, the public-facing CDC website, will be aggregated and will not have the publicly or personally identifiable information within it. That's all very private.
Well, this has been outstanding. Seriously, this has been just an awesome presentation. I've been scribbling notes here furiously. I know my young scientists have as well. And I think Miles wants to say something.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for coming today and telling us all about what you do for a living. I thought it was very interesting.
Thanks, Miles. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's been a fun path, and I get to, like I said, use that data side and that storytelling side in my day-to-day job. So there's never a dull moment.
All right.
Well, excellent. And again, yeah, I echo those sentiments. Thanks very much. That was awesome. And I'll keep you in the loop on things.
Perfect.
Yeah, there's going to be
Thanks.
lots of exciting things coming out of this. And yeah, we'll keep you in the loop. Thanks again.
Let me know. And I mean, feel free if you have questions, let Dr. Rob know, and he can let me know if he's not able to answer them. I can definitely help out to the extent possible.
Yeah, great stuff.